Thank you very much, Simon. So first of all, I'd like to thank you. This is my first time at OSCON, and you've asked me to come up here and predict what the future of open source is in front of the open source cognoscenti here. So this could very well be my first and last time at OSCON if everything I'm about to say is wrong. So you've really set me up. Well done. Thank you, Simon. When looking at the future, after the few minutes Wikipedia searching most of us do to try and work out whether something is true or not, I looked into some of the usual quotes, and you find out that this quote wasn't actually made by Yogi Berra. Equally, this quote, which often comes up in presentations, was not made by Arthur C. Clarke. It was made by somebody else called Amara, and it's actually properly known as Amara's Law. In our industry, this is probably the one which gets bandied about the most, attributed to the then head of IBM, who didn't actually say this. So conscious of everything I say here would be corrupted by time and appear on Wikipedia, and I want to make sure that this quote doesn't actually appear and come back to haunt me. This is probably the laziest cliche that always comes up in presentations, and so I've decided to use it because it's actually simple and very powerful. So when looking at the future of open source development and how cloud will impact upon it and the impact that will have on the distribution, I'm going to use that quote as a sort of a fulcrum to examine what's going on, who's doing it, and where it's happening in the stack. And this is very much informed from the experience that we've had at Canonical over the past year and a half of working in cloud computing. So first of all, what's going on with open source development? Well, pretty much all developers now have to assume hyperscale from the very beginning. I think everybody assumes that when they start writing an application, it will become the Facebook of the future, and that is now possible. Infrastructure is no longer an excuse here. And so the very first thing that people hit against as a problem is the data and databases. And this is why we've seen the rise of the NoSQL movement, which is so intimately bound in with the cloud, because this is the first problem that you hit as a developer. But we're also seeing, alongside this, the rise of the DevOps movement. And at Canonical, where we developed the Ubuntu One service, we have a very tight integration between the development and operations sides, because it's the only effective way to do a hyperscale project like that. So looking at where this is going to go next, I think the development of tools to help the DevOps people not worry about things is going to be the main trend that we're going to see. So while data is still an issue, and products like Hadoop and Cassandra are helping to address some of these issues, I think there are other areas which are still ripe for focus by the open source development community. I think networking is one which comes to mind, and by this I mean DNS, IP management, load balancing, all of these problems which are still there and need to be dealt with even at a abstracted infrastructure level will have to be dealt with by the open source world. And teams which are actually constructed to be DevOps teams and to develop the software from the very beginning, I think stand a much better chance of success. This is not a case of starting with development and throwing it over to the operations guys to iterate through it. This is teams that actually built from the very beginning. I think that those projects will come out and those will rise to the fore. So who's doing this? Well, a lot of the hyperscale development is both being produced and used by the likes of Facebook, Google, and Yahoo, and sort of obviously Hadoop and Cassandra come to mind here. But I think we've noticed a trend over the past year or so of what I call the progressive enterprise. These are companies who are using the same tools, they're using the same software that these large hyperscale guys are, perhaps not to the same scale, but they are still using exactly the same application because they have bursty data or bursty compute needs. And this software they're deploying is all open source. The proprietary world has not really innovated very well here. And it's obvious why, that the cost barriers for these companies using hyperscale computing doesn't make sense for them to have the friction of taking on proprietary applications. So where's this going to go next? Well, I think we're going to see more enterprises using these tools, and I can see this leading to a second wave of OSS adoption. If the first wave was associated with the move from Unix to Linux, which Red Hat did so well, I think we've still seen there's a lot of proprietary applications still sitting in a private data center. And I think these open source tools will lead the second wave of OSS adoption into the enterprise. And consequently, there won't be a slowdown in innovation. I think open source is really well primed to be catalyzed by more enterprises getting on board the open source wagon who perhaps missed it the first time round. And where is this happening? Well, obviously in the data side of things, it's all out in public clouds for the most part, whether this is Amazon Rackspace for infrastructure or Google App Engine and Azure for platform or Salesforce for SaaS. this is all happening out in the public sphere. There are open source alternatives for doing this in a private world, but there are only one or two options at each layer of that stack. The stack is very deep. I think open source has been very good at giving options at every layer, but ultimately we still only have a few options to evaluate at each layer. So where next? I mean, this has been said before. We're going to see more public clouds emerging now. I think people know there's the potential for lock-in here in a particularly problematic way. And so I think we're going to see with the initiatives like OpenStack and the work that Eucalyptus is doing, more and more public clouds competing, but at all the different levels, not just for infrastructure, but also for platform and ultimately software as a service. But we are seeing a tipping point over towards private clouds now as well. I think the past year we've seen the education of enterprises, we've seen the proof of concept deployments, and now we're beginning to see the production deployments. This has been particularly driven by the realization that actually the horse has already bolted the stable, that the developers in the enterprise are already doing stuff out on Amazon and other places, and that the CIO needs to tempt them back in by giving them a similar infrastructure, which they don't have to then re-architect for. And at the stack layer, I think we're going to see a widening. Whilst we only have one or two options at each layer of that stack, we're going to have more now. And as we see, there's more announcements coming out of different projects trying to compete with each other to try and produce that Apache best-of-breed software. So where does this lead the distro? Simon also asked me, how does this impact on Ubuntu? Obviously, if I answer this incorrectly, Mark Shuttleworth's Black Helicopters may pick me off here, so I got to make sure I keep the right answer here. But obviously, I think that the forecast for the distro is good. So first of all, what is a distro? Ultimately, it's the kernel is the start of it, but for most people, it's the applications which are the critical part of the distro. Distros made it easy to get access to the applications. They made it easy to use them, easy to upgrade them, easy to maintain the security updates on them. And that slickness of experience, which Ubuntu is particularly interested in, making the software, whether you consider it rocket science or not, making the experience of using it, to use the Apple phrase, delightful, is essentially what the distributions are doing and continue to do. But also, we mustn't forget that the distributions are often the place where the largest communities form. They are the place where bugs, translations, whatever, tend to land first because they are the first place that the user tends to interact with. So where's this going to go next? I sometimes wonder where we're using the wrong phrase, stack. Stack implies many levels which don't necessarily interact with each other. I think the distribution is exceptionally well placed to help all of these different layers interact with each other, and it acts more like a system or more like a jaw, where everything is fitting in across one common layer, and that's essentially what the distribution is providing, and that's not changing. Cloud computing is only making a number of ingredients in the mix more complex, there's more permutations, and the distro is there to help that. And the way it helps that is by sort of stepping back a little bit. VMware may say that the OS is becoming irrelevant, and it might be becoming less relevant as a percentage of the total pie that developers and operations people are looking at, but it's still absolutely essential. And to a certain extent, OSs which don't draw attention to themselves either through their cost or through their complexity of use are going to be the ones that win out here. And this is why we feel Ubuntu is very well placed in the cloud and we're seeing such good traction. So the analogy I often think of is that the operating system and the distribution tend to be like a very good film director. Without the film director, nothing could happen. You couldn't get the film out there. But the best film directors, the ones who are most well regarded, are the ones who step back and are slightly invisible from the process, and you don't notice their heavy hand over things. And I think the future of the distribution is to step back and let the application shine, but provide that slick integration feel, which is critical for the DevOps people to do the innovation that we want to see in the industry. Thank you very much.